Well, my name is Mike Elk. I'm a contributing editor within these Times, and occasionally I write for The Nation as well. I covered the labor movement, and the one thing about the labor movement is people try to put on one-size-fits-all solutions. That somehow, if we bring in immigrants, or we bring in community members, or we motivate young people in a different way, we're going to revive the labor movement. And I think people come to these answers out of frustration that things in the past hadn't been working. There's plenty of enthusiasm in this country for unions and people that want to join unions. 60% of Americans, according to several recent polls, would join a union if they could. The problem is only 1 in 6 organizing campaigns ever result in a contract, and about 1/3 of all organizing campaigns, somebody gets fired from their job. So how do we get people over those barriers? How do we get people to take the big risks that the labor movement entails in order to get people to go through the gauntlet of trying to organize? And I think the key part of it is, one, making them feel like it's their union and they're not being told something else to do, that if they're going to make risks, they're going to be able to decide their own course. They're not going to be sold down by the river by a union that wants to cut a sweetheart deal with a corporation like we saw in the past. And I think the second thing is we actually have to take risks as a labor movement. There's been this massive movement for concessions from workers. Even in Wisconsin, they agreed to all the concessions. Now, if all labor movement is doing is agreeing to concessions and doing these other things, even if they're just agreeing somewhat, it's very tough for workers to want to agree to that. Now, how do we get that back? And part of it, I think, is what Joe Burns has talked about in his recent book, reviving the strike. In the 1950s, there were 350 strikes over 1,000 workers, involving 1,000 workers or more, a year. In the 2000s, we've gone down to about 20 strikes a year, involving 1,000 workers. This is enormous. I mean, some workplaces have gotten smaller, but this is an enormous loss. And what power do you have to really hurt a corporation to make it want to negotiate with you unless you can decrease some of its profits by shutting down production? And legally, through a variety of measures, it's very tough for unions to strike. Workers can be replaced easily during strikes. So unions don't have many tools. And it really requires some real soul searching about how to really be defiant. And I think some of it involves perhaps even breaking some of the laws, doing what corporations do, spinning off subsidiaries so that subsidiary units can break the laws. We've seen this with Jobs with Justice, where that was spun off from a lot of unions so they can engage in different types of boycotts that unions couldn't do under Taft-Hartley. So I think this is a complex question.
Right.
One, the Democratic Party is not part of the whole solution, but we're sort of trapped in that system. So we have to find more ways to be more vocal about the Democratic Party. I think to do what gay rights activists like Dan Choi did, which is that you have no friends, you stand up and be vocal. And Richard Trumka, on a number of issues, has not stood up and been vocal. I also think what's happening in Wisconsin is interesting because unions are doing something beyond politics. When they took away the ability of unions to automatically deduct dues from paychecks, this forced unions to revamp their model for organizing. Now they had to collect dues individually, worker by worker. They had to get workers to opt in. So now all of a sudden, unions where you had several thousand people that were serviced by a staff representative and had no internal leadership training are now getting lots of internal leadership training. They're understanding how to do things on the job that pressure managers. They're gaining more confidence in themselves as activists because they're going to have to collect dues in order to survive, and they're going to have to actually do things on a job like complain about safety, complain about working conditions, complain about hours in order to remain relevant as a union, in order to have members still do that. So I think that's a very interesting story that hasn't gotten much coverage, is that it's leading to a revival of training union members in Wisconsin and making them feel like they're part of the system. And I think that's what we really have to get into. Part of the reason why Wisconsin happened is that there's a tradition there of the labor movement, and people had a sense of confidence that they should go out and take bold action and that they shouldn't wait. And that's really, I think, the most important part, is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution about how to revive the labor movement. It's not like there's some magic ingredients that we can just put together. This is something that we figure out how good it is while we're cooking it, and you have to be there while you're cooking it. So every situation is different. And I think that's what we really need to start discussing, is how to get back to training and education, as opposed to what a lot of people in D.C. want to do, where they invest in big media campaigns, reforming the image of organized labor. How do we get that? How do we get people involved in unions that are actually members of unions now? We're just not. Well, The Koch brothers are one of many bosses. They're kind of the coordinators. They've always been movement leaders among CEOs. I guess you can call CEOs a movement. So the Kochs are important to focus on in that sense. And people are familiar with them. They're considered toxic. They're considered weird. It's an interesting story. But what the Kochs are doing politically is no different than what other major corporations do all the time. I mean, GE does it. They just don't fund as weird of stuff as the Kochs do. I mean, so, I go back and forth on this question. I think the Kochs are certainly important to tell a story about, and they're an interesting media story in that they're very bizarre people with very bizarre lives, whereas General Electric probably spends as much money as the Kochs do in a lot of ways, doing anti-union stuff, doing anti-worker stuff in this country. But GE is much more sophisticated, and I guess it's not as exciting.